Hey guys, welcome to FGC University at Coach's Corner, and today we are going to be talking about misinputs. As always, I'm with the usual suspects. We've got Ramses and of course Tony, and really excited to go through this episode. But before we do, I need all of you watching this. First off, happy holidays. Hope you've been enjoying them. And second off, go ahead and subscribe, man. Keep the merry living going, right? That's what we need right now. And we appreciate you guys subscribing. We also appreciate you guys pulling down, joining the Discord, and sending some questions our way. We love answering them, and we love going through these things and discussing these topics with you guys. So without further ado, right, misinputs. This one's always been a huge one. I feel like in Ultimate since it started. I know a lot of people feel, a way about the buffer system and how what inputs are being prioritized and everything like that too. So starting off, I want to open the floor to you, Ramsey. Like, how do you feel about kind of misinputs, both as a player? I know, again, you are a really technical player, but then also too for being a coach, of course. Like, how do you feel about those things, and what do you think people need to look at to help themselves improve in dealing with that?
Yeah. And so before I dive into that, I want to quickly shout out Alto, who actually asked us a question regarding misinputs in the Discord. So if you guys are subscribed to the Discord, you can ask us questions, right? And I think, actually, Bam, I'm going to start out by reading the question, and then we can kind of go from the direct question. I think that's a really good starting point because Alto's question is great. So Alto writes, misclicks, misinputs, the controller sometimes ignoring what you want. They happen. Of course, we're not talking about the dude, I totally didn't mean to forward smash. But the genuine mistake that was in your control, but you did not mean to do. My question is, how do you deal with this sort of situation when it wasn't what you meant to do and it was fully in your control in your eyes? What can people do to try to move past those game-losing misinputs and misclicks? And how can people's view on them, being the ones that control the misinput or misclick, be changed to better help them going into the next game or set? And I think this is a good question. So my approach with mistakes is always twofold, right? One side of what you want to do is you want to prevent, and one side of what you want to do is you want to be able to deal with it if it does happen. Because, like mistakes happen, and I think especially in Smash, something that I think is very important to realize is just how many buttons you press playing Smash. I think like a game of Smash can have between both players like thousands of inputs. And so even if your mistake rate is, let's say, 0.1%, you're still making a bunch of mistakes, right? If we're talking about thousands inputs, 0.1%, you're getting a bunch of mistakes. And those can be minor. It can be, oh, this was the wrong drift on the jump. Or it can be major, as in, oh, I arrow share when I didn't mean to. And so what I think is most important for people who struggle with misinputs is to always kind of center yourself in the present, right? I think at the end of the day, focus on a mistake is extremely understandable because the mistake kind of pulls you out of the present, right? It's like, okay, well, this is something that I didn't want to. We as Smash players were trying to problem solve, and so this is a problem that presents itself. You want to solve it, and so you start focusing on the mistake that has already passed. And so we've talked about this before on the channel. I think at the end of the day, most of your mentality is solved by being in the present. Now, the thing is, how do you force yourself to be in the present in these situations? I think the core of what you want to focus on is awareness. I think awareness kind of underlines everything. I think what we in the West often kind of, I say we in the West, I think that's a little pretentious, but what I've noticed from my peers, what often happens is that people try to control something. Maybe too much. It's like, it's not like, I should be like, it's often a thing where it's like, okay, well, I have to realize that this is happening and then I have to do something about it. And what I've personally found is that just the awareness of the fact that this is happening and for example, your feelings about it, right? Like the circumstances, how you're experiencing it, is often enough to fix problems like this. And so on the topic of dealing with it when it happens, I think oftentimes what you want to do is you want to say, hey, misinput happened. This sucks. I'm going to let myself feel like it sucks, and then I move on. Because if you try to ignore it, then it's just going to brew. And if you focus on it, then it's just going to spiral. And so what you got to do is you got to give it the room, let it exist. And by acknowledging it, by having that awareness of like, hey, this is what happened, this is how I feel, and then refocusing on your goal. In other words, there's the awareness of what's going on, but also an awareness of what we want to get, right? By refocusing on your goal, refocusing your awareness there, that's where you're often going to get pulled back into the present. Because at the end of the day, right, like it doesn't really matter what happens. What matters is what you can do about it. And so it's always important to refocus on what you can do. And so that's like the mental side. In terms of preventing misinputs, I think at the end of the day, all you can do is practice as much as possible. And on top of that, like I said, there are so many inputs in any given Smash game. It's also important to let yourself misinput every so often. And I don't mean that as in like, oh yeah, dude, like fucking go out there and misinput all your combos, drop all that. I mean more so like when it happens, forgive yourself, right? Give yourself that grace and take it as a learning opportunity more than anything, right? Not in the moment, but more so like, hey, maybe I'm noticing that I'm dropping this combo more often. In retrospect, I should go back to the lab. At the end of the day, all you can really do is take it as information to learn from. And so prevention-wise, I can give you the standard stuff, right? Like lab it out, know your B&Bs, etc., etc. But really, what I think is most important with these misinputs is to always give yourself that grace, understand the circumstances. Pressure increases misinputs. Tiredness increases misinputs. Just the sheer amount of things you're doing, right? Like there's bound to be misinputs. And instead of focusing your energy on your negative experience, let it be, right? Like give it the room to exist and then move on. I think that is really the most important thing that you can do to handle misinputs. What would your advice be, Tony, for those who are struggling with misinputs, both in terms of preventing and coping with the fact that you're misinputting?
So I think the first thing to understand is to go ahead and echo Ramses, is that you are inevitably misinputs every game. And I say this as having studied top 5, top 10 players, 3-stocking their opponent, sometimes even JV 3-stocking their opponent. And then when we looked back at the VOD, we were still able to find mistakes or inefficiencies in their play and how they could have been improved. Multiples. So point being, if the best, most technical players in the world are making mistakes every single game, then you have to be skill gapping the best players who currently play the game, or else it probably wasn't actually as far into your control as you think that it was. So once we understand this, and we understand Smash as a game where mistakes fundamentally exist, then it's a matter of examining these as probabilities, and then asking yourself, how could I have affected the probabilities? So think of it as if you are drawing cards from a deck of cards, yes, you are able to affect that and how you play with the cards that you draw. And you can even affect what cards are in your deck based on how you build that deck. But at the end of the day, what you are still beholden to is still essentially RNG elements. Life is just too chaotic to actually control. Even is something as simple as the atmospheric units acting on you in that particular room that you're playing in. These things aren't as constant as we would like them to be, and assuming that they have any effects on your input variability at all is to say that there's too many variables affecting your variables for it to be predictable. So once we've accepted this chaos and this lack of control, again, as Ramses said, then from there it's a matter of you just accept that mistakes are going to happen. Some of those aren't actually going to be in your control. Some of them you could have affected more and learn from. And you can't realistically find out in the moment. And if you do find out in the moment, then you need to understand you are conceding every game action after that. So choosing between compounding your mistakes or just being patient enough to learn from your mistakes, and once you're no longer making those decisions, is enough for you to, or at least for me, it is compelling enough a reason to focus on just letting the mistakes go and then going back to it. Now, if your counter argument to this is something of the nature of, well, how am I supposed to go back and review it if I'm not saving every match? And that's why you will have heard me quite frequently harp on the suggestion to record every game, save every replay, If you need to get something like an AverMedia to record it directly, fine. Get yourself an SD card, that's fine. But even with a budget of something of like $10, you should be able to find some mechanism in order to save your replays that will work. Most humans that I'm aware of who are playing Smash in tournaments also have a smartphone. You can get something like a micro SD and an NSD adapter to even upload your replays one by one to YouTube during the tournament. So it is possible for you to look at your replays during a multi-day tournament on YouTube and review your play from day to day within that tournament. And so once you understand, this is an example of how we can control our environment by affecting it. But even then, if we're supposed to look at this specific example, maybe you have bad data in that particular area. Maybe you've lost your YouTube account for some reason, or you were hacked. These aren't necessarily things that you can make choices on, but these are things that you can affect. The likelihood moves from 1% to 99% as you execute reasoning and judgment on these situations, as you exhibit forethought. But at the end of the day, the kind of decisions that we're making during the game are largely intuitive decisions. These are not things where you're explicitly thinking through things, flow charting things out while you're playing. If you're doing these things, you're making a mistake in how you format. These are not supposed to be conscious activities. These are supposed to be subconscious activities. The time for thinking is once you put that controller down. But while the controller's in your hand, it should largely be your subconscious piloting the game. So, in the meantime, as for how you can affect those, at the end of the day, the more often you have practiced a specific action, specifics, the more likely you are to execute that specific option again in the future. And so it comes down to specificity. Once you are reviewing these replays, or once you are watching your VODs, whatever, a simple method to go ahead and do this is just get a piece of paper and just write down the misinputs that you make, and then add a tally mark or some such in the count, and just focus on practicing the specific exercises or misinputs that you're making the misinputs on the most. So if you're doing that, that just helps you target, and keep it simple. You don't have to practice after every misinput you make, but once you reach higher levels, this is something that will naturally correct itself. Once you're making relatively infrequent misinputs, making the same misinput twice in a game is actually a big, oh wow, this is actually a big improvement for me to make. But for most lower levels, like me myself, if I were playing the game right now, I would probably make 3-5 misinputs of the exact same nature on a given game, and then so I can then look at that. So that's 5 different interactions where I'm suddenly going to outplay my opponent just by practicing that for the future, so that my future self is going to input that correctly, we'll say 4 out of 5 times next time. Or even if it's 2 out of the 5, that's a significant judgment. That's 40% improvement. So if you can do 140% by hitting the same execution check 2 more times, that's a pretty simple improvement. It's going to make a big difference in your play. So at the end of the day, the more mistakes you're making, the more obvious it is going to be for your other skills to recognize. So if you are new to VOD analysis or checking your misinputs, it's less likely for you to notice a given misinput. But if that is a companion skill to your actual misinputs, then when you are newer to executing, to practicing your execution, those are going to come up more frequently, and so they'll be more noticeable for your own ability. So nice little intuitive skill development there. Bam, what's your insight on this?
So there's a couple things, right? I think for one, going into misinputs, right? A lot of times too, some people are afraid of doing this, but maybe you want to check also the ways you're putting in these inputs, right? So for example, there's a lot of cases where there's a multitude of ways to do if you're doing like a type of slingshot, for example, or IDJ, right? There's a lot of inputs that can result in the same thing. And sometimes people just be like, oh, well, this is what I was taught to, like, this is what was taught to me. This is what I saw in a video. And so I'm just preferring to do this one, right? If you feel like you're getting so many consistent instances of misinputs for this, then I think that, it's good to kind of reconsider, hey, maybe we just need to relearn from the ground up. Maybe there's an input that's just more preferable to me, something that I can just do far more consistently. And if I can, then I need to switch over and take the time there, right? Obviously, this is not something that you're going to do in the last second or whatever, but this is like something more as you are continuing to develop. Like, you have the time, like it's good to actually do research on this. And I'll tell you, I'm surprised at how many players that I've seen over the years that will just literally just be like, they know that they kind of don't get this all the way, right? And they will just stay with that same input till death because that's the way I was taught it, even though I'm not getting the result I want. So I'm just going to keep on doing it. No, like take the time to change, do your due diligence and go from there, right? So I think that's a really big one. I think another thing too is there's also certain inputs like option selects, right, that can help you mitigate those kind of things, right? By making it where the game can make you just be more consistent, more efficient with things, right? I know we've talked about option selects before already on this, on the podcast, and you guys maybe have seen some little things, but I do know that's still something that's not used a ton in Smash, right? So for a lot of people, just kind of the basic gist, right, is essentially you are doing a series of inputs, and based on what happens next in the game, a lot of times it's something where it could be either like hit lag or shield lag or like a priority system, whatever it may be. It will essentially shift what that input result is going to be, right? And so the game is essentially selecting it for you by the next action that happens, right? And the great thing about that is that it can cover multiple options, right? And so that's why that's usually really good. And sometimes that's great because sometimes, hey, maybe you're having a problem doing your something basic as your up air and getting that trap to a dash afterwards, so you can get that you can trap that air dodge, whatever it may be. Hey, maybe you want to use an option select there, right? And that can help you just kind of mitigate those misinputs. Another thing too is, of course, we're talking about how to reduce misinputs, but also part of Smash, and I know Ramses kind of alluded to this earlier, is that you also got to know that you're going to make mistakes. You are human. And so one of the biggest things that's great in any competition is being able to be like, oh, if I do make the mistake that I tend to do, what do I do after that, right? This may not be the optimal thing that you want, but you should still understand what pathway this leads to, because you know this is the mistake that you've made before, right? So even keeping tally of those mistakes is not just about like mitigating them, but it's also understanding them so you can turn some of that into a strength, right? You understand that sometimes you mess up, and instead of getting that bear that you want in this scenario, you don't get you don't get the proper reverse right on the idea of whatever bear, and you get a fair instead. What happens next? You should know that, because you make that mistake. It's something you're trying to work on, and you need to be prepared for that. Players, no matter how good they are, they're going to make mistakes. But one of the greatest things sometimes, and even when you're seeing these videos like you were talking about, Tony, when someone's getting they're getting a 3 stock or the JV4, yeah, there's a lot of times they make mistakes, but one of the big things is it doesn't matter because they're still on top of that person. Yeah, they probably had something they can do a bit more optimal there, but they keep it going, right? Because they're in that flow and they understand, like, okay, I still know where this can lead to, and I can make it work, right? And so being able to like optimize the unoptimal, right, is going to be a good thing for you as you are building towards mitigating those misinputs. But I think that is all encompassing of what you should be looking towards as you're like kind of moving forward in your play. But yeah, I think that's a really big one for me.
I can really relate to that, right? When I was playing Qylwok has a lot of cancels that are super timing specific. And I know, like, I would back air space on a shield, but if someone spot dodges, I'm not getting shield lag, like you said, right? And I was practicing getting the option select in so that I would, like, get a cancel on a late and an early timing both. And I knew I would fuck it up sometimes, and then I'd just be standing there in my silly little Monado Arts window. And at a certain point, I just got good at realizing, okay, I fucked up. I realize I'm fucking up, and instead of panicking, I would immediately go to the next step. So really, really agree with that. I wanna add to that too, and this is again something that I think is very important, is knowing what circumstance you're vulnerable to. And so for me personally, I've definitely had tournaments where I would be warming up, and just by the way that I would input my tag, and this sounds like It sounds like superstition, but it was actually like the way that I would input my tag would tell me how good my execution would
No,
be
that's
for like
real. That's
the next
actually
couple
real.
of
That's
sets.
actually so real. Like, yeah, if you feel like you're on point, you just done, right? If you start,
I'm saying,
you're like, okay, hold up. Yeah. No, I agree with
when
that. I
I
agree with
like when I go over one letter too
that. Yep.
far or I input this, it was there, right? And so like understanding the circumstances that you're in and having a plan B is also important. And so I was already kind of saying like, okay, well, under pressure you're gonna miss input more often. If you're tired, you're gonna miss input more often. Well, when are you the most tired in the bracket and under the most pressure? It's in grand finals, right? And so for me, whenever I would find myself in grand finals and I would notice, okay, I'm kind of dropping some of my inputs, I would just simplify. And so I can do like slingshot nair, and speed art, but I can also just go for like nair dash tack. Is it pretty? No. Does it get the job done? Yeah. And I feel like you got to keep in mind, right? A lot of these mistakes will not go punished unless you essentially take the risk of doing doing something that is punishable and hard most of the time. Of course, you can misinput on simpler stuff. But what I mean is like, okay, well, if you're going in there and you're going for your like crazy again, like your Futsu out of shield down gun Joker confirm, which is like very tight, you do it knowing that if you fuck up, they could punish you. A lot of misinputs go unpunished. Oh, I didn't mean to full hop there. Well, you're probably still in a position to mix up. Oh, I meant to forward air instead of nair. You're probably still fine doing nair, right? And this is something that especially Tony often talks about, and I think he's so correct about that. Is that because this game is so fast, initiative is strong, and most of the time your opponent's not in time to react to your initiative. And so the same goes for your misinput, right? You're like, even if it looks silly, most of the time, like let's say you whiff a forward smash. Most of the time you're getting dash attack at worst. And then maybe afterwards you die, of course. But it's not the end of the world. And if you're ready for the fact that you mess up, and then you know you got to play this advantage after because you get dash attack, well, you're already in a way better position. So like Bam said, being ready for failure is important. I think simplification in these circumstances is important. And I think it's important to understand that most of these mistakes do not really lead to that bad of a situation. Of course it can, right? I'm not excluding that it can. But most of the mistakes that you're making aren't that bad unless you're committing to a mistake that is just iffy. And if you're in a situation where you know you're under pressure because you feel in your mind, you're like, oh, I'm going to do something iffy in tournament. And then that, that pressure is going to make it even more likely that you mess up. That's a choice, right? And so being concrete about like, hey, I am choosing to do something that is executionally difficult in a pressure situation, and I could lose the game if I fuck up. I think that helps you accept the fact that you're misinputting. It still sucks, right? Because like you intended to do the right thing, and then it's not about your intention but your execution. But let's be fair, without execution, Smash would not be a fun game. We would be playing fucking rock, paper, scissors. You know what I mean? Like literally, you take away the execution from Smash, you're playing rock, paper, scissors. And so you gotta accept the whole package. You cannot say, hey, I like Smash, except for the fact that I can mess up the execution. Because without the execution, there wouldn't be Smash. And so I think that, to me, also helps with the coping of the execution. Because there were definitely times where I would be like, oh, I had the right idea. Like, I had the right read, and I just fucked up the execution. And it would get me tight. But at the same time, it's like, well, like I said, if there wasn't any execution, I would not be enjoying Smash. And so it's the total, like it's 100% of the game or 0, right? There's no in between. You cannot say I like Smash but not this part. It's all part of the game. One final thing I want to add, and this is more so getting maybe a bit semantic, but I hear the sentiment a lot. Alto was talking about the game losing misinput, and I think that is such it's a mind trick, right? The game losing misinput. What do you mean? Like, you guys are last hit, last stock, and then you lose due to misinput. I get it, but like, you guys were last hit, last stock. It wasn't a game losing misinput. There were way more things that you could have done better to not be in that last hit scenario. And of course, I know, you play people close to your skill level. That's, the most frustrating loss is when you're close and then you misinput. Of course. But it's important to keep your eyes on the prize and to say, hey, The misinput sucked, but how did I get myself into a position where I was under so much pressure, or the game 5 got me so tired, or I decided to go for something that I know I'm not consistent at, right? Like any of those things, they got me to the point of misinputting. And of course, like Tony said, and I alluded to a little bit earlier, there's gonna be misinputs, and so you gotta plan for a little buffer. You gotta plan to like to not have close sets with people because misinputs are so ubiquitous in this game. So I think that's also important, is to say like, hey, this might not be a failure of execution, but a failure of planning. So keep that in mind.
Yeah.
I will say, as a matter of study, that especially I believe we see this more so in games like chess, but the concept is that there are a very large diverse of board states possible that you'll need to play from, puzzles to solve. And so if you want to solve a puzzle with your intuition, it helps to have solved either the same or similar puzzles prior. And so generally whenever you are wanting to play from a misinput, part of why it's so jarring is because you are less likely to have played the game board from what it looks like after you've made a misinput than after you have planned out that input. So a couple ways we can take advantage of this is that first of all, when you are practicing your routes or mapping out your flowcharts, don't just map out what it looks like when you execute it, but map out what it looks like when you mis-execute it. What are the next most likely outcomes? And then also work on those as well. So part of why we see, I believe there's a bit of a stereotype for flowchart and mid-level players where they're very smart, very thoughtful people who think out things, and then they get hit in the mouth and they play like an amateur. And so a big reason for why that is because, again, going back to the chaos of what a game of Smash tends to be, you can't plan for everything, but you can plan for more than you planned for last time. Let the chaos ensue, and then find out which specific chaotic things happen that you weren't expecting, and then plan for those too. And then as this continues on and you continue to grow, either there is a finite amount of chaos and you'll eventually start to have mastered enough that you can actually predict most of what will happen, or more likely what will happen is you'll at least improve your process of having similar puzzles. And so this goes back to our discussion on how you can improve from having played or studied other games, is that even though they will be different games or different situations, because we have trained ourselves to have pattern recognition, even if it comes to a problem that otherwise looks different, we can see similarities and then approach those problems to similar ways that we have approached problems prior. So, another way to go about this in practice, a specific execution example I recommend is if you are already evaluating game states by a frame, say paused matches, this could be frame by frame game analysis, etc., then something you can do is actually just pick random spots on your VOD, go to it with pause, and instead of focusing on, well, how did I get here, focus on, well, where do I go from here? And if you practice this enough, you will be less likely to focus or tunnel vision on the circumstances that led to a position, and more a matter of, well, if I'm in this position, how do I play this to my best? Because only one of these things is actually relevant unless you're going back to learn that actual flow of the game. But if you've seen that position before, or more importantly, what I think people tend to do is that when they watch VODs, they will form an emotional connection to one or both of the characters, or they will connect it with emotions and memories that they have of having played it, which then color the actual game. The game state is not affected by whether you are playing hot or cold. The game board simply is, and you could have recreated it with CPUs technically. So even though circumstances are more likely to be human players when played by humans, the relevancy of those existing is not important to the emotional element of there having been a human there. It's just the game board is what it is. The solutions to these puzzles are what they are, and there's usually multiple solutions that we can select from. What were you going to say, Ben?
Yeah. I was just to say like just kind of my final like notes on it, but I know you guys talked about this a little bit prior, but again, going through the whole idea of like you're gonna make mistakes, mistakes happen, understand they're gonna happen. I like the point of just being like, and there's a lot of times mistakes them in and of themselves are going to be punished. I don't think they're going to be punished nearly as much as some of these other games too. I think in traditional fighters, you're probably going to get more of like an issue there because of just kind of the spacings that we deal with, right, in kind of large scale as well. And especially because again, the odds are for people who are watching, you're probably like there's going to be some people who may be high level, top level, whatever it may be, but vast majority of you are not going to be at the top. If everyone's at the top, then they're going to be a top, right? Like, so the idea is that usually at those levels, it's less about you just making that mistake and more of like, how does that affect your mental? How does that affect you moving forward, right? Because a lot of times what happens is a player who's like a mid-level to a high level or wherever it may be, they make a mistake, right? And it's like kind of like a whatever mistake, and it's like, oh, your brain is just focused on it. You allow it to essentially embody the rest of your mental capacity, right? And you're just automatically stun locked, like you just stun lock yourself. And then someone's like, "Oh, cool, I win. I don't have to do anything anymore. You lost to yourself. Congratulations, right?" And that is a really big thing as a player, being able to be like, mistakes do happen. That is a part of life. Obviously, you do your best to mitigate them. Obviously, you do your best to understand, how does that shift things, right? How does that shift the game board, like Tony was talking about? And how do I easily identify that so I'm prepared for something that I know can happen? And then also being able, like, mentally letting myself be okay. Like you were talking about earlier, Ramses, where it's like, giving it space, breathe, move on, right? And that's something that's really big in life too. If you sit around and you have that one moment and you actively choose to drag that moment out longer, you make that moment in one day become years, decades, you're cooking yourself, right? Obviously, there's going to be certain things that are going to warrant a deeper discussion and a deeper like reflection on. But especially when you're playing a game and you're playing in a moment, you have to give yourself that bit of time, and then you got to move forward, right? And then you got to kind of go, get after it. Because if you get stuck there, 9 times out of 10, for a lot of players at like low to mid, and going to high and something like that too, the reason why they lose is because of the mental afterwards. It's not that mistake in and of itself. It's how they allow that mistake to just cascade into more mistakes and more mistakes and more regret and more sorrow and more anger and more excuses if the controller blah 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 blah, all that kind of nonsense, right? So be aware of that, how that affects you, and you do what you got to do, right? So you can move forward, because at the end of the day, hey, mistakes are going to happen. You have to acknowledge that to move forward.
Yeah, and to add to that, I'm gonna do my final spiel too. I think it's good to think about your actions not as a consequence of what happened before, but as a driving force to get you towards a goal. And so if you make a mistake and that leads to frustration, how does that frustration support your movement to your goals, right? And so you got to keep in mind your goal when you go to a tournament. I mean, it can be anything, but I assume that you just want to win the event. You want to do as well as possible. If your goal truly is to do as well as possible, what benefit does it have for you to ponder over your misinput? Because it's in the past, you cannot control it anymore. And so if we think about frustration as moving us towards a goal, well, what goal does frustration move us towards? And the answer really is, and this is something that I think a lot of my students eventually come to accept. And I know I say a lot of my students because I think a lot of these topics are very universal, right? These are very universal problems that people experience. But for this one especially, frustration is a way to cope with the fact that you're not as good as you thought you were. And so if you're losing, which contradicts what you feel like you should be doing, you feel like you should be winning, it's very easy to kind of deal with that negativity by saying, oh, well, I mean, I misinputted. That was not my best, right? Like, that was not me at my peak. That was me misinputting the forward smash, and that's why I lost. And so that's what frustration does. It moves us towards that goal of like, okay, well, now I have like this barrier between the world and myself, right? Which is the ego. Um, it allows me to interpret this information in a way that protects my ego. And that's what a lot of frustration is. Frustration is often, um, it is a bit of a, what is it? I think a bit of a false dichotomy. I think that's the best way to describe it, because frustration often comes from a lack of control, right? But realistically, if you cannot control something, then we shouldn't be worrying about it too much. And if we can control it, well, then go out and control it. And so if you're frustrated about a lack of control, that at the end of the day is you're trying to have your cake and eat it too, right? And so what are we like, what's the best way to overcome frustration? Well, it's acceptance. It's the fact that you can say, well, hey, there's this thing that I cannot control, but that's fine because there's so many things that I can control. And if your goal truly is to win the event, is to win your next match, then what should you be focusing on? Where should your mental resources be going? It's the things that you can control, right? But if your goal is not to win the event, if you have a goal, and I'm not saying you don't want to win, but if one of your goals is to protect your ego, which for a lot of people it is, which fair enough, then you're gonna spend mental resources protecting your ego and saying like, oh well, again, like that's not me. I it was a misinput. And I've been there. I'll be fair. I've been in situations where I felt like I should be winning and then I lose because of a misinput. And having been there, I can say confidently that it was a lot of ego. It was a lot of like, okay, well, I feel like I should win, and you know, I don't want to accept that maybe I'm just not at the level that I want to be yet. And so, what I really encourage you to consider is when you feel that frustration, instead of being like, well, I misinputted, of course I'm frustrated. Instead, ask yourself, like, what does that frustration do for you? And don't be like, oh, nothing. There's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, actually, this doesn't do anything for me, so I shouldn't do it. Like, that's not the way to go about it. There is some sort of positive outcome, or at least the way your brain perceives it, right? There is some sort of positive outcome from this frustration. Try to identify it and see if that's something that you're okay with. Because there is a world where you can say, well, actually, I would like to hold on to this. And then you accept the frustration for what it is. But I think in most situations, people want to get rid of their frustrations. And so really consider that. And what that's going to lead you to often is to ask yourself, well, what are your actual goals? What are you actually trying to achieve? And yeah, I think that's a really good part of the journey. As Bam often says, I think your improvement in competitive gaming, especially Smash, often is very directly translatable to improving as a person, right? And I think this dynamic of like understanding your frustration and turning it into acceptance and understanding your goals and where the frustration comes from. It's a life skill. It's something that you can truly apply to so many factors of I don't want to say everyday life because I hope you don't get frustrated every day. But it is common, right? Frustration is a common emotion. And so being able to handle frustration, identifying that lack of control, that friction, and the goal that you're trying to achieve, and the goals that you're not aware that you're trying to achieve. Those are all very good things to do. So yeah, I urge you to take the plunge.
Yeah, 100%. Tony, bring us home, man. Any last words?
I hope everybody has a great night.
I hope everyone has
Poggers, bro.
Got them.
It's time to sleep.
Absolutely, man. Well, that's all for this episode here. Hope you all enjoyed. Once again, thank you so much for checking in with us. As always, go ahead and join the Discord and also let us know in the comments, what kind of questions that you guys have, what topics you would love us to go over. But thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting us as always as we go into this new year. We really appreciate you all. From the watching, from the subscribing, that means the world to us to continue to yap about the things we love. So we appreciate you all. Anyways, happy holidays once again. Hope you enjoy, and class dismissed. See y'all next time.
See y'all in 25.
Hey, peace.